There are some wonderful examples throughout the Scripture of people charting new courses. And we're going to talk about Moses and Israel out of Exodus chapter 3 this morning. And Moses and the new course that his life took on several different occasions. As we begin to do that, I want to point out the Hebrew number 40. Arba'im in Hebrew. 40 is a very important number, especially in the Old Testament. It represents transition, change, the concept of renewal, or even a new beginning. So as you trace 40 through the Old Testament, you'll see it come up a lot. In Old Testament covenant, the practice of ceremonial washing took place in a ritual bath called a mikveh. And Jewish law says that the mikveh should be filled with 40 measures of water. And then you are to immerse yourself in the mikveh, and you rise spiritually renewed and clean. It's no accident when you look at Old Testament law and understanding that rain covered the earth for 40 days. The earth was submersed below the water. And as the water receded, the world was again purified. Just like a Jewish person coming out of the mikveh. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai and came down with the stone tablets. The Jews arrived in the desert at the foot of the mountain as Egyptian slaves and left 40 days later as the people of God. Moses was without food on Mount Horeb for 40 days. Elijah wandered without food for that same period of time as he sought God. Jesus wandered in the desert for 40 days without food prior to his temptation. But today we talk about Moses' life. And Moses' life is broken into three 40s. His first 40 years was spent in, approximately 40 years, was spent in Egypt. As a son in the house of Pharaoh. The most amazing life you could imagine in Egypt. Riches and wealth beyond compare. Recognition, importance, power. He was put in the basket as a child as the other children in Israel were being slaughtered. Because Israel was becoming too powerful and populated. They had to cull the people. And he floats up at one of the baths of the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's daughter takes him out of the water. She knew he was a Hebrew child, but she wanted him. So Pharaoh said, "Fine, have him." And he grew up in that privileged world. As he grew older and he began to realize who he was and what was happening to his people, we know the story. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he killed the Hebrew. He killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand. Next day, he sees two Hebrews fighting against each other, and he says, "Come on, brothers, what are you doing?" And they say, "What are you going to do? Kill us too, like you did that Egyptian you buried in the sand?" Word got back to Pharaoh's household of what Moses had done, and Moses ran. The end of his first 40, beginning of his second. He ran to the mountains. And there he met his wife, her family, raised children, became a shepherd, a herder. His life in Israel was finished. he probably never looked back. I mean, his life in Egypt was finished. He probably never looked back. But then something happens, doesn't it? God says, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt. And in so many words, he says, that chapter in my life is closed. I'm not going back. There's nothing you can do to make me. That's his third 40 years, the beginning of it, where he spent time in the desert with the people moving toward the promised land. For each 40 years brought into Moses' life incredible transition, but renewal as well. Today we're looking at that beginning of third 40. Moses chapter 3, if you have your Bible, go ahead and open up to Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 15. It says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, well, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Moses never expected to leave Egypt in the first place, but we know that he had to. Pharaoh heard that he had killed an Egyptian, and he was responsible for that life. I think that Moses was relatively comfortable in Pharaoh's house. I think that he enjoyed the perks of being royal, even if it was adopted? Did he struggle with seeing his people of birth enslaved? Yes, I think so. Did he work on their behalf? Probably so, down through the years, to comfort them and to help them in their misery. See, but something happened, and it created a transition in his life. The killing of that Egyptian caused him to have to leave what he was comfortable with, have to change his life in a dramatic way. But this unexpected transition became a source of renewal and a new beginning. How did that happen? Well, going to Midian, meeting his wife, living with and working for his father-in-law, Jethro, creating a family, having children, building a home, in a sense, a new career. It was a blessing in disguise, in a sense. And he was happy in Midian. He was comfortable in Midian. But something happened to prompt another transition. As he is out with the herds, he sees something in the distance that looks like it's burning, yet not consumed. He goes to investigate, and he encounters God. God says, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt. A transition that he was not prepared for. A transition that he did not want. But it became a source of renewal and another spiritual blessing. How might this apply in our lives? See, you may never have expected to be going through what you're going through right now. Good, bad, or indifferent. But something has happened in your life, probably multiple times, that prompted a need of transition. A change. And oftentimes you were quite comfortable the way things were. You were happy with your life. You were okay. But sometimes life has a way of messing our happy up. And it calls us to transition. It calls us to change. But the unexpected transition in your life can be a source of renewal and can become a spiritual blessing. It really all depends on how we deal with it. Like Moses, you may have an argument with God. You may say, God, I'm not ready for change. I didn't ask for this. I don't want to do that. And he says, but that's the plan. That's what life has for you now. That's where you're headed. We've got several ways to deal with that. We determine, number one, how long we're going to fight with God. How long we're going to be angry at Him. How long we're going to continue to go back and forth. But what if, or maybe, or why not? Before we allow ourselves to move into that transition. And look for the blessing to come. Now we know in Moses' trip back to Egypt, it wasn't filled with blessings. He was encountered by resistance. He was encountered with mocking. He was encountered by distrust even among his own people. For a period of time, he increased their workload and made it more difficult on them by them having to glean their own straw and not cut back on the number of bricks that they would have to produce. And he could have said, God, what's going on? This isn't what I expected. You told me to come back. I thought it'd be all peaches and cream. God says, just keep doing what I'm calling you to do. We see the progression of the 10 plagues and the eventual release of the Israelites to move off into the desert and in search of the promised land. But then we see Egypt and the army come back after them, and the people say, why have you done this to us? I mean, just a couple days into the desert. Why have you brought us here? We are hungry and thirsty. We had everything we needed in Egypt. Now, that's a recurring chorus that Moses heard for years in the desert. This is your fault, Moses. God, don't you hear them? They're blaming me for this. It's your fault. God says, just work the plan. Just work the plan. We could say at the end of the third 40, where they are at the precipice of the promised land. And Moses, late in life, is taken up on top of the mountain and looks across into the promised land. And in so many words, God says, Moses, you'll never make it, but I want you to see it. What are you doing that for? It's better not to see it if I know I'm never going to make it. In an odd way, that was a reward for Moses, not a punishment. He got to see the fruit of his labor for 40 years with a disobedient, hard-hearted people in the desert. And God says, that's what you have brought them to. And with that, he died and was buried. A hero to some, a fool to others, yet one who was faithful in transition. See, it doesn't matter what other people think, whether they love you or hate you, whether they think you've made a good decision or a bad decision. What matters is that you are being faithful to what God is calling you to do. And there's some verses that I just want you all to jot down that talk about making it through these transitions so that the transitions do become renewal and spiritual blessings. Transitions can become just transitions if we don't allow God to work in them. They can be just another change in life, another ho-hum, what was it, kind of moment. Philippians 4:13 reminds us that I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. When that transition comes, remember Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Him, Christ, who gives me strength. This is a horrible situation, but I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. I don't want to be in this place, but I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. I didn't ask for this trouble. This was brought on me from the outside, but I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. In the midst of that transitions. The other verse is Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. I didn't ask for this difficult time, but God works in all things. God can take this difficult transition and turn it into a blessing. Let's look back at Moses' life. He is fleeing for his life out of Egypt, running into the open desert, not knowing what he might face, being pursued by soldiers who wish to take his life. He is not saying, "This is great. I love games like this. It's a super game of hide and seek. High stakes hide and seek. If they find me, I'm dead. I love it." He is in fear of his life. He is in an unknown territory. He is by himself. But God took that and He worked it into something beautiful for Moses. The burning bush. Moses, time to go back to Egypt. I don't want to go back to Egypt. They were trying to kill me when I left last time. I don't think they've forgotten about that. So he goes back. And things don't work out like he wanted. Continually, time and time again. On into the desert for 40 years. But God took it and worked it for the good. And turned the transition into a spiritual blessing. And a time of renewal. God can take your circumstance and turn it into a new beginning only if you let Him. Only if you let Him. I believe very strongly that you and I both can say no to God. We can simply say, "I'm not doing it." What I'm asking you today to do is to say yes. And allow Him to take your transition, your circumstance, and make it into a new beginning. 2 more verses that I want you to hold on to and to hide away in your heart for those difficult times. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. You all know this one. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. In the midst of circumstance, in the midst of transition, in the midst of difficulty, in the midst of the unknown, trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Don't do it your way, do it His. But John, it's so hard to grasp what His way is. I get it, I know. But if you're open to His way, He will open it to you in time, sometimes very quickly, sometimes not so quickly. But if you're open to Him, He will open His way to you, because Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope in a future." And I add this, if you let me. If you let me. I've created you with a free will to say yes or no, to choose me or not to choose me, to run away or run toward me. And I want to prosper you. I want to bless you. I want to bring this circumstance or this transition or this difficult time and turn it into a new beginning and a spiritual blessing. My challenge to you is to let Him. Let Him. That takes the control out of our hands. That takes the power away from us. But it's scary. And it can be painful. And it's often uncomfortable. But Moses saw God work in his life through each segment in his life. The first 40, the second 40, and the third 40. And in each of those, everything wasn't great all the time. But in each of those, God made himself known. And Moses, in all of his humanity, with all of his foibles, followed. Challenge you to follow God in the midst of your circumstance today. Whatever it may look like, however it might feel, and be faithful to him. How that has worked out in your life, I don't know. But you might be at a point in your life where you're ready to say, okay, God, I get it. I'm ready. I don't know what it's going to look like tomorrow, but I'm ready. I'm sick of carrying this burden. I'm sick of pushing back. I'm sick of arguing with you. I surrender. I let you have your way. If that's your point in life today and you need prayer, I challenge you to come and receive prayer. Maybe you know somebody who's at that point, and God's laying them on your heart this morning. And God's saying, I want you to go and I want you to pray with them and for them this morning. Before they leave church, I want you to pull them aside, and I want you to hold on to them, and I want you to love them, and I want you to pray for them. That can happen in here. That can happen out there. It can happen at the youth soup luncheon today. It can happen out in the parking lot. And if you're a rebellious human being, like so many of us are, and you say no to God, and you get home, and they get home, and God says, why didn't you do it? It's not a lost opportunity. Because you can get in your car, and you can ride to their house, and you can knock on their door. Got both sides knocked on, so my OCD is okay. And they say, what are you doing here? And you say, God told me to pray for you at church today. And they'll go, we're not at church anymore. And then you and your humanness can say, I know I failed you and I failed God, but I am here. Can I pray? Don't ever think you've missed that opportunity.